Yeah, I have 2 points to make today. The first is a very practical point, and the second is more obscurely philosophical. The first is that by paying attention to science, especially in forest management, we can increase the profitability of our natural resources while sustaining old-growth forests, which is good for both people in the construction and housing business. It's also good for people who breathe air. The philosophical point, I think, is important, but you'll have to be patient with me as I try to suss it out. But for most of modern history, we have assumed a Darwinian sort of competition, both in nature and in economics, which pits individuals and species in a life or death competition for resources that allows the victors to survive by killing off their rivals. Like many such assumptions, you can point to evidence because it is partly true. But it's not entirely true. And where it's not true creates a crucial flaw in that assumption and how it leads us to conduct ourselves. But let me start with a conversation about forests. I trust that everyone remembers the 2009 blockbuster film Avatar. And sure, the 3D technology was amazing. The blending of CGI images with actual filmed actors really advanced the technology of movie making. And even the whole of it, it involves space travel and sci-fi and nature, and that would normally be enough to get me into a theater seat to see it 2 or 3 times. But it did seem to me that even though they spent a record-setting $237 million to produce it, that someone forgot to hire a writer. They had 3-dimensional images, but all the characters were 2-dimensional. And the plot was so predictable that if it hadn't been for the popcorn, I would have said the whole thing was a waste of time. The intent, however, was to contrast capitalism in a 2-dimensional consumerism way with the sacred nature of the earth or nature itself, again, in a very 2-dimensional way. The plot was like a 3-hour-long rendering of Dr. Seuss's books, The Lorax, which I love in the 5-minute version, but the 3-hour version was tedious. But if I may set my role as a movie critic aside for a moment, I will have to say that on later reflection, there is a certain redemptive aspect to this too thin plot. In its enthusiasm for accentuating the sacredness of nature, it portrays all of this distant planet's flora and fauna as being actually neurologically connected, and all of them are connected to a single great mother tree, which seems to retain the souls, or at least the voices, of generations of natives and to possess profound healing properties. But what's really weird about this terribly anthropomorphic plotline is that it contains a fairly surprising level of truth. As a spiritual community, one of the things that we've tried to grapple with over the past decade is how to spiritually express our passion for preserving nature. And we talk about how we're all connected. And you can quote Bill deGrasse Tyson as one of the modern apostles who says that we're all connected biologically, we're connected to the earth chemically, to the universe atomically. But we struggle, I think, sometimes to articulate how our spirituality and our passion for ecology are related. It's hard for churches to get their arms around. But as I have read about this work in research with forests, it increasingly seems to me that forests are not just philosophically connected. They're actually connected. And that somehow that has something to say to us about how human civilizations are connected. It turns out that beyond that philosophical statement that we're all connected, and flora and fauna are all connected to each other, trees literally communicate with each other. And I'm not saying that they talk to each other. Please don't press the point to absurdity. It's not like the Ents in the Lord of the Rings story, but they communicate. Susan Simard, a Canadian professor of forest ecology, has demonstrated that the roots of trees combine symbiotically with fungal threads that will spread and stretch sometimes for miles, connecting tree to tree, even different species of trees, and that through this web of threads, trees communicate with each other, and more than communicate, they will actually share resources. That if Darwin was absolutely right, that the large tree is sucking up all the nutrients and water, then everything around it would die. But in fact, we find that they will limit their own consumption in order to share carbon and water with weaker, smaller trees. Her TED Talk on this topic is 20 minutes long. I think it's worth the watch. 4.5 million people can't be wrong. A lot of pseudoscience has tried to appropriate Simar's legitimate research. I like to say the way a drunk uses a lamppost, more for support than for illumination. So you have to be careful here when you're reading environmental science. There have been books on the New York Times best-selling list that take Simard's legitimate research, combine it with their own overactive imagination, and maybe some Ouija board sessions, and they come out with the conclusion that souls have trees and plants feel pain and that they follow the constellations of the stars. Let's not be sentimental or mushy about this. There's serious science going on in the forest, but let's not turn the trees into people. They're not people. But the part of this that is both surprising and very important is that trees do communicate to let each other know about a need for resources, sometimes to share it, sometimes even to give out warnings that a certain kind of infectious beetle or disease is coming into the forest so that they can produce their own resistance to that. And again, that's not personifying them. They're not talking in that way, but they are chemically communicating, and they are somehow knit together, defying our assumptions about the universal nature of greed and self-interest. Forests are, for us, not just a beautiful place to take a walk, but they are a resource. We use wood to build our houses, to make furniture and pulpits, and because different kinds of wood have different properties, we tend to sometimes overrule nature and extinguish one kind of tree in order to grow what for us is a more useful, a more valuable tree, because we want nice furniture, we want to build strong houses. But we've tended to manage our forests in a way that give us an immediate return on investment. What the lumber industry calculates as board feet. How many millions of board feet can you harvest from a particular stand of trees? And for most of human history, we have harvested this by clear cutting. We still do it in the United States in some places and in Canada in some places, but for most of human history, we've done it that way. In Brazil, where a lot of the rainforest is not actually usable wood, they're just burning it. Now, we've all heard of the rainforest referred to as the Earth's lungs. Something like 1 out of every 5 breaths you take is air that is coming out of the rainforest. But their current completely crazy president, Bolsonaro, is encouraging the burning of the rainforest in order to create grazing territory for beef cattle. But in the United States and Canada, where so much of our forests have been clear-cut, the timber industry wants to come back to those clear-cut areas and plant new trees to take the place of the ones that they've harvested. But here is where Susan Simard's research has been especially helpful. They discovered that the saplings planted in a clear-cut area, even though they no longer have to compete for sunlight or water or nutrient, are still weaker and more subject to diseases than saplings that are growing up in an old-growth forest. Now that's totally counterintuitive. Saplings carefully planted where they get full sun and lots of water should grow faster and be stronger, but they don't. They appear to do better in the company of big old-growth trees that will share their resources. Turns out that we're really talking about a forest like a family. At the risk of sounding a little too much like Avatar, she demonstrated that the older, healthier trees send nourishment to the weaker saplings so that the floor of the forest becomes a network of communication between plants that will inform and nurture one another, sometimes even at the expense of their own need for resources. The stronger, healthier trees work to nurture the weaker and younger trees in ways that fly in the face of our assumptions about competition in nature. The forest ecosystem is very complex. Competition does exist, but it would not be entirely mistaken to characterize a forest as a kind of democratic socialist society in which those with greater resources support those in the greatest need. Now, we've assumed that trees were naturally competing for sunlight and nutrients and water, but it turns out to be much more complicated than just that. That does exist, but the real relationship is infinitely more complex. And that's what amounts to a kind of botanical altruism. Again, I don't want to anthropomorphize this, but within a forest community, every tree is not willing to kill off the other trees for their own benefit. Now, I want to thank you for bearing with me up to this point. I know I'm punching above my own weight class here, but do stick with me. When Darwin was working out his theory of evolution based on survival of the most adaptive, the natural selection of the strongest and healthiest specimens in nature, economists were about a generation ahead of him describing human economic culture in roughly the same way. We've tended to accept that competition for resources is what inspires us. It's what makes us more creative. It's what makes us stronger and smarter. And that's why we are here, and all of those variations on the way to becoming Homo sapiens between an ape and a human basically disappeared. We put them out of business. If you Google Adam Smith, the economist, and Charles Darwin, the evolutionary scientist, you'll find a number of scholars who will tell you a lot more than you want to know about how dependent that Darwin was on the writing of the economist Adam Smith, because he was looking for natural occurring tendencies. We have accepted, uncritically, unthinkingly, most of us were taught economics in unconscious ways unless you actually registered for the class. But the assumption that humans, plants, and animals all evolve in a ferocious competition for resources, and that survival depends on being basically the bully on the playground or on Wall Street, and that we take a Darwinian approach to capitalism where the strongest must be adaptive to survive, without throwing any shade on either Smith or Darwin, both of whom were geniuses in their own right, I think that Susan Simard's work asks us to at least make some room in our minds for a both-and relationship. There is ferocious competition for resources, both in economics and in evolution. But there is also, just beneath the leaves and the surface of the dirt in the forest floor, a socialist network that is saying we are all stronger and healthier if we work together and share resources. In fact, Faris Jabbar with the New York Times illustrates this both-and dichotomy in a piece he wrote on Simard by talking about the 250,000-acre forest in northeast Wisconsin that has been managed by the Menominee tribe for the last 200 years. To you and me, if we just went up there, it would look like an old-growth forest. But it has actually been carefully managed for harvesting usable woods, but the tribe protects the healthiest specimens and takes out the weakest ones for lumber. They let a tree live up to 200 years old before it's harvested. And that grandmother tree that they leave in various areas of this huge forest continues to nurture the regrowth of the trees that they've harvested. They have taken more than 2 billion board feet of lumber from that harvest, and there is still more than 2 billion feet of usable board feet standing in the forest. This makes it one of the most financially profitable lumber operations in North America, while making it look like nothing has ever been harvested. If this forest were clear-cut, they could make a lot of money immediately, but they would be destroying this socialist commune that is literally a cash cow. And that's right, you heard me say socialist commune and cash cow in the same sentence. But for 150 years, this tribe has made a tremendous amount of profit by carefully harvesting this forest. All the while, the forest is sequestering harmful carbon in the ground, it's manufacturing breathable air in its canopy, and it's holding soil in place while naturally cleaning and storing water. The forest is working for us and making a profit for the tribe. What we see in clear-cut forests, what we're seeing in the burning of the Amazon, is a real illustration of that old parable about killing the goose that laid the golden egg. You can immediately reap a profit, but you are taking profit from the future. It's not that capitalism is always evil, just most of the time, or at least that's my opinion. And it's not that socialism always works. I mean, we can point to any number of examples of socialism that had gone over the top and killed off incentive and innovation and hard work. It is that a careful and intelligent management of capitalism and socialism combines two ways of understanding the world, and they feed each other and make each other stronger. We get into this conservative-liberal debate in which we liberals think that conservatives just want to roll back every environmental regulation until there isn't a bit of breathable air or drinkable water left on Earth, and conservatives think that liberals want to shut down business and progress of every kind until the Earth looks like a jungle everywhere and there's no people left. There is, however, a both-and way of letting capitalism inspire progress through competition while preserving our economic engine through sustainable management of our forests. And of course, I'm talking about forests today, but you could put that into many other resources. Liberals, as nature-loving as we might be, still want to live in houses. And we still want to have a table and chairs in the house. We don't want to clear-cut the globe. We want to manage our resources in a way that will keep our children and grandchildren in houses with furniture too. Just like by limiting the amount of fish that we take from the ocean, we can make certain that there will always be fish to catch in coming generations. By managing our rivers and our aquifers, by protecting our air, we not only are preserving our environment, but men and women, we are preserving our capitalist markets to make them safe for future profits. Sadly, however, in our partisan nation, it seems like the trees are communicating with one another better than Republicans and Democrats. Yes, from a spiritual perspective, from a purely ethical consideration, I believe that our rich nation should have a living wage that could even be paid to everyone as a guaranteed basic income, as a floor for every human being. I believe that health care is a human right, and it shouldn't be denied to anyone. And I believe that education costs should be such that the children of the poor have a fair shot at a good education so that the economic classes in America do not become set in cement. But for capitalists, do you know what's really good for business? You've been told over and over that it's cutting taxes, that businesses need you to cut taxes. And if you follow tax cuts and economic trends, cutting taxes has been one of the most damaging things we've done to the business environment in America. What's really good for business is customers who have money. If your customers have money to spend, it is not cutting taxes that inspires the economy, it's consumers showing up at your store to buy your goods. And you know what's good for employers? What's good for employers is having employees who are healthy enough to come to work regularly. And you know what's good for the tech and economic industries? Having employees in our own country that have enough education to put their dreams and aspirations onto paper or in the laboratory where you can make 2 or 3 or 4 working vaccines in less than a year. Something that has never, ever happened in history before. But these miracles do not happen by accident. They happen when we have the resource of highly educated people who communicate with each other. And as much as some people have criticized China in their role in the coronavirus this year, the fact that they had sequenced the DNA before COVID-19 started to spread around the world, and they just gave that information away. It's like a network of scientists who talk to each other when governments are not talking to each other. This didn't happen by accident. It's still a miracle. I mean, it's still just amazing. We've never had a vaccine for any coronavirus ever, and it's been around for generations. But we did it in less than a year through cooperation. When the stronger trees feed and nurture the weaker trees, the whole forest gets stronger. People are, in the end, not that much different than trees. Forgive the gender-specific quote, but the truth is, we are our brother's keepers. And that's not just for our brothers. It's for us too. Building a strong society benefits every one of us. So we should stop trying to kill each other off, either economically or evolutionarily. Thanks.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.